Hey everybody, it's your old pal John from Humor and History. Yes, the name is changing. We are still young enough. So here we go. We are going to get involved with what the U.S. would be like if America lost the Revolution. Okay, this is going to be interesting for my British viewers. Interested to hear your thoughts on this.
The battles of Lexington and Concord. The opening shots of the American Revolution pitting a scrappy colonial army against the might of the British Empire. It was the culmination of years of harsh treatment from the English forces, including the massacre of peaceful protesters in Boston and the tax hikes that led to the Boston Tea Party. And the world watched as the ultimate underdogs led by George Washington turned back the forces of Great Britain and created a new country, the United States of America. But what if it didn't work out that way? 700 British soldiers had been sent to destroy colonial supplies and cut off the rebellion before it could start.
Right.
Warning was given by Paul Revere and the other riders of the British arrival. But in this timeline, a stray butterfly spooked the horses of the warning team, keeping them from ever reaching their destinations.
Okay,
The
that's
British
fair.
swept in and captured the arms caches and arrested the ringleaders planning to fight the British. Prominent founding fathers like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin were interrogated by the British, likely disavowing all involvement, but one thing was sure: there would not be an American Revolution in this timeline. Under the hard-nosed approach by King George III, the potential revolution had been quelled, and he would likely take care to make sure it never repeated. British troops would maintain a strong presence in the colonies, rooting out any sign of rebellion.
I wonder what would have happened to Benjamin Franklin. He was actually quite well known. I don't want to say well. He was kind of like I don't know, like a favorable Elon Musk or whatever. Kind of like a superstar in those days. So I wonder what Great Britain would have done with him if they would have actually put him in jail.
George was infamous as the king who had the harshest approach toward the colonies, spurring increased resistance, but it's likely that after a close call, he might have been advised by those he trusts to hold off on any new taxes for a while.
And
After all,
Parliament.
the colonies were a valuable resource, so it's likely that the status quo would have remained in place for the next few decades as long as George III remained in power. And that
Hey, by the way, remember, only about a third of the people in the colonies, in the United States and the colonies, were pro-revolution. There were about a third that really just wanted to keep doing what they were doing, and there were a third that were very loyal to the crown.
would be a while. George III has a reputation of being a bit of a disaster, but he was actually the longest reigning king in British history, serving for almost 60 years. His successor, George IV, was seen as a dilettante who only reigned for 10 years. Selfish and irresponsible, his reign was heavily influenced by his advisors, and as such, it's likely they just would have advised him to keep things going under his father's colonial policies for the term. After all, there were parties to attend back in London. But back in the colonies, things have changed a lot. Many
didn't
of the
know.
founding fathers who defined
You know what? I to be honest with you, I don't know much about George IV. I should know more, but it's 10 years that I don't know. Maybe you guys want to put something in the comments just to give me a kind of a heads up.
the March to Independence have since passed away, with Franklin and Washington likely not having anywhere near the influence on history they did in our timeline.
Right.
However, it's likely an independence-minded movement continues in the colonies.
I
focused less
disagree
on
about
fighting for
Benjamin
independence
Franklin.
than
I
on
think
developing the colony's culture, and they have a lot of room to do it in. While the original United States post-revolution was only composed of 13 colonies, the British territories they're part of now are much larger, including much of what's now Canada. And the crisis happening in another country might be as big a factor as what's happening in England. While the American Revolution didn't happen in this timeline, odds are another revolution did, the French Revolution. The circumstances there were primarily driven by poverty and populist rage
Yeah.
against an out-of-touch monarch. And while it's possible that the American events helped to influence it, they also quickly spiraled out of control, and the Americans who supported it in our timeline were rather ineffectual at pushing it in their direction. And some were even imprisoned for their efforts. So odds are that Danton and Robespierre still rose, and the king and Marie Antoinette still wound up facing Madame Guillotine.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Benjamin Franklin was in France for a long period of time, and he had a tremendous amount of influence. As a matter of fact, people kind of like looked at him as a interesting person, just to sort of look back and see the guy. And but he was he was slowly feeding sort of the ideas of revolution.
And the Reign of Terror still sent France into chaos until it fell, leading to the rise of Emperor Napoleon.
Right.
And that would give
Okay.
Britain the leverage it needed. France and Britain have long been bitter enemies, and in our timeline, both southern empires declined significantly in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Britain saw itself lose its colonies, while France lost much of its territory to Britain in the 7 Years' War. That gave Britain a dominant foothold in North America, including control of the French-speaking territory of Quebec. So with France relegated to rump territory in the continent and dealing with political upheaval, odds are that Britain would have been able to take America's place in the Louisiana Purchase in the early 1800s, giving the country near total dominance of North America with only Spain to oppose it. But the dominant...
Although I find that very interesting that Great Britain would have enough troops to take over if they're fighting the Napoleonic Wars. I am interested to see how that would work. There might have been some kind of a battle in the Americas to take over the Louisiana territory. Or would it be Spain? I don't know. Because maybe at that point, maybe Great Britain was stretched very thin when it comes to certainly the Americas. Or maybe it would have been, I don't know, more Canadian. It's very interesting. Whoops. It's very interesting. Yeah.
Country would...
Because it was originally purchased from Napoleon.
...be able to face a major challenge. The United States' history was largely one of expansion for most of its first 70 years. But a major crisis was brewing: slavery. The new country chose to keep the oppressive institution to appease the southern states, although it did abolish the slave trade in 1807. This just led to it creating harsher rules to keep its enslaved population in perpetual bondage. It wasn't until the 1860s, after a brutal civil war, that the United States abolished slavery, and even then it was over a century before the system of racial oppression in the South would be addressed. But in this timeline, things would be very different.
I figured.
You might think that under a colonial power, progress might be even slower. After all, Britain helped bring the institution of slavery to the continent of North America.
And they stopped it in 1833, but yes, it was the beginning of slavery there. Or not the beginning. It was put in place by mostly Great Britain.
Along with other colonial powers. But actually, the slave trade was abolished in Great Britain the same year as it was in the United States, and pressure continued amongst abolitionist members of Parliament to eliminate the institution for good. The result was that in 1833, Great Britain passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which eliminated the possession of slaves in the country and all territories controlled by it, with the exception of those managed by the East India Company. That included the massive North America territory.
I thought so. So, whether we want to believe it or not, a lot of it had to do with the cost of slavery. It's not free labor. It's not cheap. It's not easy just to do that. It takes a lot of logistics and things like that. A lot of things go into it. I'm not excusing it by any means. But it would have to be... I don't think it would be in 1833 that there would be the abolition. There might be the abolition, as I said, across the areas that are not North America. But one of the things that the South in the United States Civil War bet on was the intervention of Great Britain, because the supplies of cotton that were sent. That were exported. It was huge. It was called, cotton is king. And now it didn't necessarily happen that way. They got cotton from India and a few other places during the war, but they really were betting on that. And it was a huge factor. But if there's no war going on, maybe they might step up and sort of support what's going on in the South.
So how does this play out across the pond? The abolition of slavery in the UK went relatively smoothly because Great Britain was not an agricultural-driven market. It was a relatively small island nation quickly becoming...
I'm going to take a bet here that the South would be more frustrated. The southern states or the southern colonies would be more frustrated with the British stance.
...a hub of India. The United States might not have been independent at this point, but odds are its territorial breakdown is still fairly similar. You have the industrialized northern states and the more agricultural southern states, which are making much more heavy use of slaves. And as word starts to spread that the institution might be coming to an end, odds are we'd see some rebellion. And instead of a civil war, it's time for the American Revolution 2.0. Things could have been very different if the United States lost an extended revolution back in the 1770s, but in this timeline...
And it's important to note that a lot of the people who were loyal to the crown, they had, I think it was like a year or like maybe 18 months, maybe 2 years to leave the United States after the revolution as it was ending. And, they were given free passage to Canada. They would have stayed. So I wonder if the sentiment was a lot different, even in the South.
It was crushed with relatively
Or would have
little
been.
effort by the British. That means that the colonies would have been allowed to develop at their own pace under the oversight of the crown, and they
Yeah.
likely have all their own governors and local political figures. It's impossible to know if someone who is a governor or a senator in the US would still be prominent here, but there are some figures who are such major players who are so determined to make their voices heard that it's almost impossible to imagine they wouldn't emerge in any circumstance. And so enters John C. Calhoun into the fray. The fiery South
Statesman.
Carolina radical rose to prominence in the United States as the only vice president to lead a rebellion against his own president, supporting South Carolina in a dispute with the federal government over tariffs. He would later emerge as one of the most prominent figures in the lead-up to the Civil War, refusing any concessions to abolitionists and advocating for secession if the institution of slavery was infringed upon.
Just a quick note that South Carolina has tried to secede a number of times before the Civil War. So they are the hotbed and the political area of secession. Not saying other southern states were or weren't, but South Carolina was the spot. It was kind of ground zero in a way.
He would die 10 years before the Civil War began, but his fiery speech in Congress is seen by many as the turning point where conflict was inevitable. And in this timeline, the crisis over slavery happened several decades earlier. Instead of being a dying old war horse in 1850, Calhoun is a hale fire breather of 51 in 1833, when the
Interesting.
word of the
Yeah.
Slavery Abolition Act filters down from
Yeah.
Parliament. Odds are he's a powerhouse in South Carolina colonial politics, perhaps even the governor, and he proved that he was anything but shy when it came to opposing the government. So odds are good that when the attempt to persuade the crown out of passing the bill failed, he would be ready to defy them and try to create the Confederacy 30 years early. But this would be a very different conflict. The map of the country looks a little different in this timeline, with the much larger territory of Canada joining it. However, it's unlikely that Great Britain would have been quite as involved in the southern border and looking to take territory from Spain. So it's possible that Texas would not be a part of the United States. This means the Confederacy is little more than a rump state consisting of the southern states from Virginia to Florida, against one of the biggest empires the world has ever seen. While in the U.S. Civil War, the two territories were relatively even, with the Confederacy winning key early victories and even making inroads into the North in places like Pennsylvania, the odds are this time the war goes much more quickly, because the British are coming.
Well, and another thing is the Confederacy during the American Civil War, they received a lot of weapons from Great Britain, and now they wouldn't be receiving that. As a matter of fact, there was a ship commissioned, and there was a lot of sort of what do you call them, like black market deals that helped them sustain. I wouldn't think it's anything that would have made any major change, but it was certainly influential with the South. It helped to a certain degree. But I think either way, I think Great Britain probably would have been distancing itself from the South. I don't know if it's under John C. Calhoun, but when you do have this idea of slavery, this is a huge topic in the States, and people think we over discuss it. And okay, fine, but the idea was you have the Revolution, and then you have people sort of slavery, non-slavery. They kind of put their differences to the side for the bringing together the country. A lot of people don't realize that was a lot of frustration in the northern states, that they had to sort of bite their tongue for the good of the country. Now, and then you get the War of 1812. They call that the Second Revolution, which sort of cemented the U.S. as a country, and you can go and debate all that stuff in the comments. And then of course the war with Mexico, and then the Civil War, because it's really cemented itself solidly as a country, and the emerging issue is the secondary one after the revolutions, which is of course slavery. People say states' rights. That's what was used. But your state has the right then of slavery. You see, so slavery is always the main issue. It's not like it was, look, our state wants everyone to use soap on Sundays, and it must happen, and that's our state right. It really, they didn't care about that. It was the main thing was the state's rights, the state's right of slavery, and that was the difference between the two. Slavery was the issue, and then it just became slavery.
The early rebellion would likely be fierce and take colonists by surprise. The odds are the Southern troops might be able to take some territory to defend their region, because the North would not be expecting a fight from their fellow colonies. But when word got back to the Crown about what was going on, they would be likely to respond fiercely. While the United Kingdom stayed neutral in the Civil War and even considered giving aid to the Confederacy to weaken their old enemies, this time the whole force of the British Empire would be bearing down on the rebels.
And another thing too is you don't have the people who were sort of seasoned. They saw the elephant, if you want to call that. If you're not military, that means they've seen war. The Mexican-American War is a war that people don't really think about as being a war. It's more of a war of aggression the United States did. But a lot of junior officers, they were in the war. Grant was there. Almost everyone who was an officer during, not almost everyone, but at least half were officers in the Mexican-American War, were generals, colonels, things like that, and in the Civil War. Well, if it's 1833, you don't have that. So all you've got are people who, let's see, that obviously the War of 1812 wouldn't have happened. So there you go. You've got inexperienced leaders. It would be probably sorry to say, a shit show.
And the man in charge would have a big role in it.
Yeah, and the British would also have experienced officers because of the Napoleonic Wars. They would have that coming to it. And and maybe in the colonies in North America, maybe they would have some experienced officers from the Napoleonic era. So it's just these what ifs are kind of crazy, but
George IV passed away in 1830 and left no heirs,
Right.
so his successor was William IV, his younger brother, and one of the oldest monarchs to ever take the throne at 65. But while he only reigned for 7 years due to his age, he was one of the most consequential kings of the era. A reformer and a strong leader, he approved of the abolition of slavery and also restricted child labor and improved the welfare system. However,
Yes.
he believed in keeping the British Empire strong and would not take well to a rebellion. And the Second American Revolution would go down just like the first. The early successes of the Southern Rebellion would be short-lived, as reinforcements streamed over from Great Britain and delivered arms and soldiers. Any colonial resistance would be met with far superior forces, and the odds are that the Southern slaveholders would suffer heavy losses early on. William IV would perhaps offer them a chance to surrender, a wise move, but Calhoun, as the ringleader of the rebellion, would be unlikely to take the olive branch, so his army would go
Right.
down in flames, and the British crown would be unlikely to deal as kindly with him as the United States did with Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, bringing an end to the institution of slavery in the American colonies.
Interesting note, Jefferson Davis was never tried for treason because theoretically it could be argued that treason was legal, and they decided after holding him for 2 years not to try him just in case they would see that this 4 years of bloodshed was legal. Interesting.
And from there, things might work out surprisingly well. The path to abolishing slavery in our timeline was bumpy, with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln kneecapping efforts to enforce racial equality and a compromise over a possibly stolen election a decade later, leading to the end of most Reconstruction efforts. This would lead to a century of racial oppression and segregation in the South. But in
Yeah.
this timeline, the British would be responsible for overseeing the aftermath, and they would likely keep tighter control of the Southern colonies. The aid of the Northern colonies in the war effort would mean the colonies as a whole wouldn't be punished, but the rebellious territories would likely see a heavier British presence for a long time. And any local officials who aided in the rebellion would likely see themselves forced out of power permanently. But a lot of this would have to do with a new figure. The elderly William IV would be dead by 1837.
Oh, yeah,
and
Queen
he would
Victoria.
be replaced by not another king, but by his niece Victoria. in the latest complex succession. Victoria took office at only 18 years old, and her reign was one of the most consequential in British history. She was known as a strong supporter of British expansionism and would reign for 63 years, the longest term of service in the history of the British Crown until the modern day. So, the fate of the colonies would to a large extent be determined by the whims of this woman. Well, sort of. Britain has been a constitutional monarchy since 1688, and additional restrictions on the monarch's power were put into place since. This meant that Parliament has much of an impact on the laws of the time as Queen Victoria, and some monarchs were much more powerful than others. Victoria would inherit a British Empire at its peak, as well as an unsettled status quo in the North American colonies. But the leadership of these colonies in helping to put down the rebellion of the southern states would be in good standing with the British government, and the region would be seen as the crown jewel of the territories. And that means one major question would be brewing. We all know how the United States gained independence in our timeline, but what about Canada? It was a much more sedate affair, with the British territories holding conferences to ask for independence and negotiating an exit from the United Kingdom. There was no revolution, and in many ways the British were ready to let it go. They wanted the country to defend itself, to take the financial burden off of them, and many English-Canadian nationalists wanted to unify the territories and consolidate their control over French-speaking Quebec.
You know, and there is another thing, is like if you look at things like the Irish potato famine and before, a lot of people went to the United States early on and the population swelled. I mean swelled. And if it was under the rule of Great Britain, I don't know that it would be it certainly wouldn't be as high as it was, but it would still grow, it would still swell. So you're not talking as many people that are there. Likely. That's just my take.
But with no significant tension with the parent country, there was no desire for a hard break. So when Canada became independent, they chose to remain a Commonwealth country and maintain the Queen as their head of state while becoming autonomous in all government affairs. Would the same have happened to the United Territories in this alternate timeline? It is possible,
Sure.
but there are a few things in the way. For one, the United States is much more fertile territory and had many more resources than Canada. Almost doubling the territory gives Britain almost an entire continent to control, but it also means higher cost to administer the territory. The odds are that Victoria and Parliament would be open to these negotiations for independence, but they might drive a harder bargain, wanting preferable trade deals long-term with the new country to ensure access to its resources. Whatever the terms of the deal, odds are they would be preferable to what had been imposed on them by the British Crown as a colony. And so this new country is born into a whole different world.
Right.
In an instant, the United States of North America was born and became the largest country in the world by sheer space, containing all the territory of Canada and much of the modern-day United States. It would have the benefits of decades of buildup from the British Empire, as well as the scars of a recent rebellion. But in this time of growth, it's not the only country in North America to benefit. With the American Revolution never happening, Spain likely had the Southwest mostly to itself. Without the boost of the American Revolution to the hopes of the colonized countries worldwide, would Mexico have successfully won its own war in 1821? The Magic 8 Ball says, outlook cloudy. So it's possible that the Southwest North America would still be dominated by the Spanish crown, holding not just Mexico, but most of what's the American Southwest today. So is another war brewing?
That's what I was just
Probably
thinking,
not.
yeah.
While the territories of North
I know, I would think that. I mean, because you have the Texas territory, which would be, people would influx probably much later. Well, but without slavery. Man, well, it's interesting. We're getting into the point where it gets like so gray it's charcoal.
North America did eventually gain independence, they're all far from abandoned by Great Britain. Instead, they're likely considered extended family, and if someone punches your cousin, odds are you're jumping into the fray. So Spain would be very cautious about trying to take any territory from this new country and vice versa. While it's possible the two empires could go to war again, maybe provoked by similar events to the Spanish-American War,
But Queen Victoria was expansionist, so I mean, but it's an American thing. I mean, what am I saying? It's they're considering it its own country already. So okay, I take that back.
that would be a much larger conflict and not likely to erupt immediately. So it's possible that Texas and California might
Yeah.
never be united with the rest of the territory, but the new country is also very much not in need of extra territory. But this would change a lot of things going forward, including for many of the area's most oppressed people. What would happen to the Native Americans in this new status quo? It wouldn't be all sunshine and roses, since the British, like all colonial powers, were responsible for mass displacement and murder. But certain key atrocities might have been averted. There was
I
never
agree
a
with
President
that.
Andrew Jackson in this timeline, so there was never a trail of tears.
Interesting thing. Yes, the United States were not favorable towards the Native Americans, and as a matter of fact, throughout the wars that we've had, the Revolution and the War of 1812, it was the British who generally said to to the natives, help us out here, and we'll make sure that you're taken care of, and the people who lost the most in both of those wars were the Native Americans, unfortunately, more than both other Anglo sides.
Much of the United States' worst atrocities toward natives happened in the Rush West, which would have happened in a much more orderly method in this timeline. However, the US and Canada shared certain atrocities, such as the residential schools where native children were taken from their parents and forcibly educated to behave more like white people. Those would still exist here under the British and the new government, but there's hope for a better future. Today, Canada's programs of reparations and autonomy for natives go further than the US, and that might carry over in the Union.
Let's hope
But what
so.
about the
Let's hope that
victims
would
of
be.
slavery? Well, for one thing, slavery ends 30 years earlier. That's generations of people who aren't born into bondage. The worst of segregation never happens as well, but for the millions of people who become free when slavery ends, things would likely turn out very differently. The British control huge swaths of territory in Africa and the Caribbean, and the odds are they might offer some former slaves, especially those taken near the end of the slave trade, the choice to stay in the territory or return to their homeland. It's impossible to know how many would take the offer, but odds are
That's a
most
tough
would
one.
not want to be displaced if they had built a life here. So today's country might be an equally diverse place, but one without the century of racial tension that culminated in the growing pains of the civil rights movement. And in some ways, history bends toward the same end. The territory did eventually gain independence, but with much less bloodshed. And most of European history proceeded apace, including eventually the World Wars. The growing tension between Germany and the rest of Europe would still have happened, but with one big difference: the closer ties between the nation taking up most of North America and its former colonial power. In our timeline, Britain was largely left alone to fight the German-aligned forces sweeping across Europe for the first part of both wars, and it took major provocations to get the United States involved. A dirty German-Mexican deal the first time, and Pearl Harbor the second. But this time, as a Commonwealth nation, we likely would have been eager to get involved and help Great Britain. Canada entered both wars long before the United States, and the added forces might have helped win World War I.
It's an interesting
potentially
point.
ended Hitler's reign several years before the Allies were able to in our timeline, which then raises the question, would it have been better if the United States didn't win its independence by revolution? It's unlikely that Britain would have kept the colonies forever, and even far-flung colonies like Australia gained their independence peacefully eventually. Part of this was the natural decline of the British Empire, but many countries were able to negotiate for an exit and the benefits of Commonwealth status without conflict. Some countries weren't so lucky in the modern era, including Kenya, which fought a difficult battle for independence in the 20th century. But a country largely seen as an extension of Britain would have had an easier go. So what would the country look like now? Well, for one thing, it would be the largest country in the world. Combining Canada and the United States makes it larger than Russia. And while there's no guarantee that it would have all the territories in the Southwest by now, it's likely to have expanded somewhat. Both the United States and Great Britain are strong economies, so this new country would have had the same strong infrastructure to build off. Of course, not everything would be sunshine and roses. All of the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States still have problems with the treatment of non-white residents in their countries, and any colonial power will be dealing with its past sins for a long time. But it would likely stand alone as the world's greatest power. The United States is arguably the world's only superpower today, but the odds are good that Great Britain would have had much more power and influence than it does in our timeline. An early victory in World War II, thanks to North America entering earlier, would have given Britain a stronger hand in negotiations post-war, and it would have kept many of its colonial holdings, while the anti-colonial movement would have continued and they likely would have given many of them independence. It might have been a smoother process. After all, their biggest colony wound up gaining independence peacefully. The only thing we know for sure, if the American Revolution didn't happen, there likely would have been a lot more tea and tears in North America when the Queen passed away.
All right, that's an actual interesting point because, yeah, I mean, imagine if you look at it from that point of view. Not winning the American Revolution and being more along the lines of how Canada, how Canada's path went. That's very interesting. It would have been a lot more peaceful. I bet. I have a feeling that Americans look at this and they'd probably be like, no, never, no, we'd never do this. But the fact of the matter is when you look at the history of the United States versus what they're suggesting here, it could be a much more peaceful process and a lot of things could be averted. But then again, there is also, this is why historians just don't get into the what ifs. There's also the unknown. Okay. There could be a revolution later. There could be, God knows what. But this was pretty interesting. Let me know what you think down below in the comments, and I'll talk to you guys next time.